I live in Luther House here, and I've also kind of recently become involved in some of the activism on campus. You know, as like a part of the ICC, I had this feeling like, especially when we joined the TAHRIR coalition, there was all this controversy over it, and then I kind of felt like even after that we didn't really do anything as part of the coalition. I kind of wanted to have some outreach among ICC, because I feel like we're like a big group of people, and I feel like ICC is got a revolutionary history. So I was like, you know, I know some people who are in the TAHRIR coalition. Let's talk about it, because, you know, I also hear kind of this sometimes sentiment that ICC should only be about housing, and I really personally don't feel like that's true. While affordable housing may be our main goal, I think what's special about the cooperative is kind of the community that arises as like a result of our situation. I want to quickly say thank you to Victo and Vivian, and also Josh Sheets, who isn't here, for putting together this presentation for me, and also to Jared and Cora for helping birth this event and tying us into TAHRIR, and to Jade also for inheriting this project and working superbly on it. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of talk about my experience in activism on this campus briefly. I've always kind of been, you know, politically aware, but I never really got involved in doing much until recently. And it was here in the ICC that I finally did get involved in politics. My good friend, housemate, was another leader in TAHRIR, and he's not around anymore, and he's alive. But he lives in Europe now. You know, kind of living with him was really like, gosh, I should be doing more, you know, and this is a great place to do it. So I started going to some of the protests starting in last October. And I hear from some people, like my dad was saying to me, like, what do you guys, like, divestment in the end, does that really even do that much? And I think, you know, a lot of stuff starts on college campuses. And like, maybe at the end of the day, like, UMich's investment in Israel is not like, you know, maybe we won't do anything, maybe it's blah, blah, blah. But like, I just think that the point is like that we are here and making our voices heard, and like, you know, it's in the national news, like we're really doing something here. And what I've kind of come to see is that when I got here, I'm like, ooh, UMich. But like, over the past year, I've really started to see this university as an arm of the establishment of like the US imperial interest. You know, it is like a big government agency. I've heard TAHRIR describes UMich as a university or a hedge fund with the university attached, and I've like really come to see that over the past year. So I think the kind of activism we're doing around here is pretty important. And what I've also realized is that they do not care to listen at all. I mean, basically the only response from the university has been like repression. Like they don't even really answer. They don't want to hear from us. They don't allow us at their meetings. And then, you know, when we do this stuff, they're like, well, why didn't you talk to us peacefully? They try to play the respectability politics game when like they also are disabling that avenue. So, you know, there's stuff going on here, and UMich is prosecuting us. They're actually prosecuting me. I'm facing 2 felony charges as a result of my actions at a protest in November, which I found out about 6 months later, you know, normal stuff. And it really feels like they're coming after us to try and silence us. I mean, what did I do? I held open a door, and they were trying to close the door. The door, what was the door for? It was for a building that should have been open. It should have been public. It's the president's office. The president should talk to the students here. We pay him a lot of money. He serves us. So it feels like to me, we are powerful, and they know that, and they're scared. And that's why like this prosecution is happening, all that stuff. And it's definitely been kind of tough for me, you know, going through the legal system. I've never been a criminal before. But luckily I found a huge community. I mean, I didn't really know anyone in TAHRIR outside of the ICC before this, but like as soon as it happened, the day of, all these people like showed up to my house. They were there to support me. And so like I do kind of want to try and give back to that community, and that's kind of why I'm trying to connect these 2 communities that I now find myself a part of. And honestly, I think protesting is really cool. I've often felt like powerless in today's world. There's all this stuff going on, and you feel tiny. What, you go vote, right? Vote for Joe Biden, like, what does that do? And this is like the first time I felt like I've actually been using my power to do something real. So I think that's pretty big. I think it's cool, and you should try it. And you're not gonna end up like me. I mean, like, you're not gonna get a felony charge realistically. Even though I was new to protesting, I was definitely acting with passion on that day. So like, if you're a little more normal, you're gonna be fine. It'll just be like a good thing to go do. So that isn't something you should be worried about, but I do think it's important to go out there and make your voice heard. And yeah, I don't know, I just think like the cooperative principles of our organization really, in my opinion, direct us to like not only help ourselves, but help our community. And like, you know, by extension, the world, people who are suffering and dying, I think like as a part of cooperative, we should be helping them. that's kind of something that I've felt for a while. I like that one, cooperation among cooperatives. I kind of take like as an extension of that principle, like we should be politically active as an organization. You know, I mean, we were founded by socialists. I think we're a socialist organization. And so we should be looking out for the interest of not just ourselves, but like our community and our world community. And on that note, I'm gonna kind of segue into this beautiful presentation. So thanks for listening to me ramble, and
Hello everybody, my name is Vivian. I am a board rep here for Luther House, which means that I'm involved in central ICC operations, and quite frankly every week I find myself more and more invested in the ICC's happening because I'm continued to be inspired by the systems that are in play here, and usually by what they're set out to do, which ultimately is to help people. So let's talk about us. This is the Intercooperative Council. We are old. We were founded in 1932, as Ian mentioned, by the Michigan Socialist Club here at the university, by students who were seeking to escape rent that is inherently exploitative. They were looking to operate their own housing area, and particularly their own means of obtaining food, and to pay for it amidst themselves. We are anti-capitalist, as from the beginning we have always been about collective ownership, collective operation. Cooperation in particular was inspired by a movement of socialist cooperation in the UK, and we're going to talk about that in a bit here. Even older than us, 1860s. And cooperation to us is about that idea of co-ownership and co-administration. We can work together, we can own these systems that we have together. There are many types of co-ops. We are a student housing co-op, so our purpose is to get everybody here housing, but we work together to do that, to make sure that the houses are running, to make sure that all of the finances are handled. It's something that everybody owns a part of and everybody benefits from. We like naming our houses after people that matter to us. This is just to include a short list. We have the Rivera Johnson House, named after Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. We have Sojourner Truth House. Luther Buchel was the first employee that the ICC ever had on actual pay documents. The name of our house here. So to honor him, the house is Luther House. Often we name our houses after influential social figures, people who inspired change, often for the benefits of other people. We value that more than most else. Where did we come from? How did we get here? It was, like was mentioned, that group of socialist students in the 1930s that founded us. Initially, it was out of one socialist house, but that movement here in the 30s inspired the creation of further houses and eventually an organization to unite the houses and manage them centrally. We grew in the way that cooperatives grow generally, which is just by drawing our guidelines of operation larger and larger in order to meet more of the needs of the people. And so we wanted more housing, we wanted more affordability, more cooperativity, more community, and we obtained it over time. It looked different in different places, but it's always been cordial. The co-op movement and the Rochdale principles. These are the guys in the 1840s, off of which a lot of cooperativity, and in particular, Rochdale principled cooperativity, which we operate under or were founded under, originates from. The Rochdale Equitable Pioneers Society were a group of, to my knowledge, textile manufacturers in the 1840s in Rochdale, UK, and it was not great conditions there. You were looking at early capitalism, you were looking at a lot of wage exploitation. They were dissatisfied, and so they wanted to produce something bigger, a cooperation, a union, to simply sort of say no to the capitalist systems in front of them that were saying, you need to participate with us, you need to play by our rules. They were essentially saying, no, we can obtain what we need, the capital we need, and the resources we need ourselves. We can teach ourselves, we can manage ourselves and operate ourselves. This isn't the first time that anything of a cooperative ideology ever existed. They were inspired very much by the Owenites of Robert Owen, who one of our houses named after another group of socialists. But this was one of the biggest successful consumer cooperatives. And it was successful in that over the years that it existed, it boomed and it inspired further cooperation within Rochdale and within the community. And they established the Rochdale principles, which are our principles of cooperation. We have posters here in the Ed Center that lay out the 7 of them. The first one is voluntary and open membership, which is just kind of straightforward. Anybody who wants to participate should be able to participate for their own benefit. They should be able to opt in, opt out. It should be a democratic process. It should be acceptable for anybody. Democratic member control, which is that the organization itself is controlled by the members democratically. Often the sentiment, of course, is like one member, one vote, so everybody gets control, kind of basic democratic stuff. but basic principles wherein everybody should be enabled to have a say in what happens in whatever is going on in the operation. For them, it was stores. For us, it's houses. Members' economic participation. That's usually, to my knowledge, about members having shares, and often in the Rochdale's cases, they would all make a dividend or like a stipend of the profit that the store made. So everybody participated, everybody got reimbursement, something akin to universal equity basic income. Equity is a big, important idea to the Rochdale Pioneers. Autonomy and independence. Autonomy was largely important to the Rochdale Pioneers and to cooperators as a matter of liberation from the oppressive systems that they were looking at. Those are economic systems, and those are also cultural systems. They're interactive. So the goal of cooperative independence for Rochdale was initially that they would operate on their own entirely, and that's not just in their store efforts, in what we've talked about with equal operation of a business or of a housing area. It's also in that they valued education of themselves and their members, uplifting each member to be morally and intellectually the best that they can be in order to participate in and lead cooperation of their own. The idea is that everybody should not just be allowed to participate, but be empowered to do so as well. And that was fundamentally about taking a step away from systems that are much less fair about this, that don't give us the opportunity to have a say in our management. Education, training, and information, like I mentioned. Education, information is the most important part of cooperation. It was extremely vital to the Rochdale Pioneers. It was extremely vital to Holyoke, who was one of the Owenites and one of the pioneers who did a lot of writing on cooperativity. And yeah, it drives everything. Like I said, being educated enables you to be a participant in cooperation and in the operation of multiple levels of co-ops, which we can talk about in 6, cooperation among cooperatives. Because the ideal of the Rochdale dream was that cooperation can be something that applied anywhere. In their plan, they initially started with opening a cooperative storefront, but they had goals to do much more. They wanted to expand their education, they wanted to expand their community. They were immediately looking into buying housing for members such that it could be owned land and co-opted land, and they were looking to expand into further types of store activity like wholesale. The idea is that co-ops can be a sort of infectious thing, a system of working together, because any group of people can come together to opt to start it, and any group of people can manage it together. So co-ops operating together as larger groups of people would have proven to have more power than larger corporations, because we have great rates, because we're not skimming things. And together we are strong. It's simply a matter of there being so many people. And in forging operation together, we can overcome more oppressive systems that limit that autonomy. Concern for community. Community is a big element that the Rochdale Pioneers wanted. When they were doing what they were doing, they didn't get as much of an element of community that they were looking for in their first 20 years or so, talking 1840 to 1860. They ended up narrowing a bit more into market desires. What they wanted to value was a sense of community, a sense of sociality and intermingling, because that ends up being a core to these movements being powerful. It's communication and understanding and working together and respecting one another. It was vital to them, and is arguably vital to us now, though it looks like different things to different people. But to them, it looked like a lot of equality. It looked like a lot of cooperation, driving of their own industries together, their own processes of thriving and pulling good life out of the world together. And so yeah, we've always had leftist origins. The Rochdale Pioneers were all based on socialists, and Rochdale as an idea through the 1800s infiltrated large parts of the world. There were co-ops in Europe, there were co-ops pretty quickly in the US. Some of the first co-ops in the US were actually all female housing co-ops to my knowledge, which is pretty cool. And we were, I think, maybe the first student housing cooperative in the United States. Definitely one of them in the 1930s, founded by socialists, like we mentioned before, retired of exploitative means, exploitative systems. They wanted to own and operate their world themselves. So much so that in the late 30s, the university administration was afraid of us, similarly to how they're kind of afraid of us now, or afraid of disruptive forces. This is especially apparent and driven home by what was going on coming into the late 30s. You're going into World War II era, you're going into the Red Scare. There was a lot of fear of communist type operations or antics. So even though when we started we were pretty brazenly loud about our socialist ideals, that did become difficult as the propaganda increased, anti-communist propaganda stepping out of World War II into the 50s. But Luther Buechel did make a point at some point, that executive secretary we mentioned, that reputation that we have does attract a certain amount of our members. I think it kind of attracted me because I did enjoy the idea of a system that was outside of typical renting type systems where you're signing a contract. I enjoyed the idea of having part ownership of the community I wanted to be a part of and the house I wanted to be a part of. But it truly can be a community because we can drive any motion and proposal that we desire. We can make committees for whatever we want. We can make co-ops to achieve any purpose that we would like to with the education and training that we obtain in any co-op. I think that's all that I've got for my part of this. I think Victor's going to talk a bit more about the ICC into the 60s. Thank you.
So yeah, in the 60s, there were a lot of social movements often on college campuses happening. We have evidence of ICC members associated with picketing, sit-ins, the National Liberal Caucus, and forming Students for a Democratic Society with Luther Buechel's help. We have some archival photos for you that I think are really cool. This is a call for support for a faculty protest of the Vietnam War, published in the Cooperator, the ICC's newsletter publication. And this is a photo from the ICC archive of Vietnam protests on the diag, which looks pretty familiar. And as a whole, the organization, primarily through this publication, supported calls to action for civil rights, anti-Vietnam War sentiment, and conversation about other relevant topics like women's rights. Osterwile House specifically was the headquarters for the UMich chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which earned it the nickname the SNCC House, and they did a lot of organizing around civil rights. That was based out of that house in a more like explicit involvement of the ICC in that activism. So the role of politics in the ICC hasn't always been unanimously kind of agreed upon, especially how the Rasha principles kind of apply to activism. This picture is of a Cooperator edition from 1965 that contains a lot of that kind of debate, which I bring up because we see this kind of over and over again, the voices in this publication of co-opers hashing these issues out with each other. And in this one, a co-opper criticizes the use of ICC property and ICC truck to pull a float at a Vietnam War protest. And they say, quote, "No rule was broken, but rather a very important concept of cooperatives denied." So he goes on to assert that ICC should be for living and not for political organs, which is an attitude that Ian referenced earlier. The editors wrote back in the same edition that they would defend political discourse in their publication, and most importantly, that they urged for distinction to be made between political non-affiliation and political silence. So this debate I bring up because it kind of exemplifies this debate that has been ongoing and continues today. We've all seen versions of it play out in our own time. In the 70s, forms of ICC activism continued. The ICC supported United Farm Workers by boycotting non-meat farm goods, and anti-Vietnam organizing continued as the ICC hosted the convention of the Indochina Peace Campaign, which was an organization that advocated for congressional action to end U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. In the 80s, we saw a significant downturn in activism work support of activism by the ICC as an organization. So we had organizational opposition to, quote, unrelated political involvement, meaning politics that don't directly impact the function of the ICC or cooperatives. So political content was banned from the cooperators successfully, and the ICC did remain involved in related politics, which involves stuff like lobbying local state government, letter writing campaigns, influencing university policy, but only in matters that were relevant to the cooperative movement or that would like increase the ease of management of the ICC. So that kind of short and definitely incomplete history of activism in the ICC brings up these questions of how we interpret these principles that we have on our ceiling here, specifically the principle of autonomy and independence, and the principle that the ICC has articulated for itself of neutrality. What do those things mean to us, and how can they be construed as I said before, political silence versus political non-affiliation? These are more perspectives from ICC members from the Cooperator. In 1939, the president of Russia Co-op looks to define the purpose of the ICC, suggesting that the Russia principles are simply techniques of cooperation. Another president of Michigan House in the same year calls for more commitment to cooperative values and frames education as an obligation of co-op members, which is very different than just live here. Instead, you're obligated to know about the values of cooperatives. He says the policies of racial equality and consumer and economic education seem to have been forgotten in the mad dash to secure meals, fed, and living for privileges at minimum cost. So the dynamic he observes here is an ever-present one, and we continue to have conversations about this and to negotiate like what we are as an organization. This 1965 edition of the Cooperator, decades later, asks the same question in a two-part editorial. One writer says the co-op system can represent to the college student a form of low-cost housing, but the co-ops can educate their members about the co-op movement as a whole, giving their co-opers the reasons and ideals behind co-ops. She goes on to argue that the vast majority of co-opers at that time joined the ICC because it was cheap housing, and that was it. She also cites high turnover rates and general apathy as the reason for this dynamic. But the other writer argues that, or implores co-opers to have a more optimistic view of the organization, and the thing that they agree on is that it's up to us to decide how we want to interpret these principles. So, where are we now? All of these kind of snippets of this larger history of cooperation, politics, activism can help us understand where we're at now. It's not really a history of absolute and unwavering commitment to revolutionary politics, and it is also absolutely not a history of neutrality or apoliticism. So all the figures that inspire our houses, that our houses are named after, all these cooperative principles, this cooperative history, and our continuous historic negotiation and renegotiation of these principles show us a history of activism, or at least the aspiration to pursue social change. And we have the opportunity, just like the activists that have been associated with this organization, to contend with the questions of what this organization is and where we want it to go. So that's something that we get to decide. Cooperation has no limits. We're not a rent control department building. Thank you guys.